It's Monday, it's 9:45 and we're live in Westminster.
Will the bill will go through Parliament and be scrutinised in the usual way? And critically, I think one of the things that's changed this week is not just the package, but also the approach. We're in a much better position now.
But not everyone's convinced by the government's concessions to its flagship welfare reform bill.
We feel it's not the right thing for this country or for the Labour Party, really, or for disabled people.
It's all a long way from the euphoria of a year ago.
I have just returned from Buckingham Palace, where I accepted an invitation from His Majesty the King to form the next government of this great nation.
We'll be looking back at Keir Starmer's first year in power. And 1 in 4 young people in England have a mental health condition. We'll ask this mental health campaigner why. Joining us today, Labour MP Natasha Irons, Conservative peer James Bethell, The Guardian's Raphael Baer and Mercy Muroki from the Centre for Social Justice, a right-thinking, leaning think tank focused on tackling poverty. This is Politics Live. And we're going to start by taking a look at some of the headlines today, starting with the Daily Mail. BBC chief should face charges over Glastonbury, they say. And the Sun newspaper on a similar theme, saying the Prime Minister has said no excuse for BBC hate. And the BBC reporting the story too. Starmer criticises appalling Bob Vylan IDF chants. This is about the UK punk duo Bob Vylan, urging death to Israeli troops during their Glastonbury set. So what is the main issue here? Is it that it was said in the first place or the fact that it was broadcast, Natasha?
Well, I think it's both of these things, isn't it? There's no excuse, there's no defence of what was said. Look, there's a long-standing tradition of artists being able to express themselves politically in any way they wish to, but there is a difference between expressing oneself and inciting violence, and I don't think there's any excuse in what was said. I'm really pleased to see that Lisa Nandy got on the phone straight away to the BBC to ask what was in place in terms of its due diligence in this case, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of that.
So a BBC spokesperson said that some of the comments were deeply offensive and added that it had issued a warning on screen about very strong and discriminatory language and said that the set will not be available on BBC iPlayer. James, what do you make of it?
Well, it's great that the BBC tries hard to get young people and its viewership numbers up. But this was a totally predictable mistake. It is an artist with a record of breaching protocols. And the BBC needs better management systems to ensure this doesn't happen more. I really find it regrettable. And the BBC, for all of its commitment to Glastonbury and its years of experience in this kind of situation, needs to learn how to handle these situations better.
Raphael, do you agree with that?
Actually, I'd be interested to know actually how that process works. I mean, it's worth pointing out. I mean, first of all, self-evidently, I think a chant that begins "death, death" to anyone or anything is whipping a mob into a state of hateful violence. So, separate to the cause in question, there's all sorts of ways you can express solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian cause without urging death on people. So, that, in a sense, I'm kind of more interested in why it's sort of culturally normalised for a whole bunch of people turning up at Glastonbury to think that's actually OK or in any way sort of an expression of a socially just cause. And then separate from that, the BBC point, it wasn't broadcast, it was sort of streamed on the iPlayer. It took about 5 hours for it to come down, is that right? I honestly have no idea what was going on, who had to escalate this, whether that's, in some worlds, maybe that's actually quite efficient. I don't know. So there are lots of people who are have a very itchy trigger finger to start attacking the BBC in these situations, and you can't say that because you're a BBC presenter and you have to be very balanced about this, but I can. And I think when you see those newspaper headlines making this all about the BBC, doesn't even mention the RDF, doesn't even mention the artist in question, that seems to me a slightly disproportionate reaction.
Mercy?
Well, I think you can't stop these things sometimes in terms of artists saying very controversial things. We've seen what's happened with Kneecap. And what struck me in particular was the amount of sort of support and cheering that lots of, when this was said, lots of the crowd sort of, were sort of in support. And I think that speaks to a bit of a culture, particularly amongst younger people. There is this culture brewing, really kind of anti-Israel, happy to kind of call for death for Israeli soldiers. And so I think whilst you can't stop artists from saying controversial things, I think for me it does have to be a question of, well, when we know there are potentially controversial artists, do we really need to be displaying that on a public broadcaster? I would say not. I do think the danger, though, is then you sort of start having the BBC policing which sort of art and which acts they can and can't have, and it's a really tricky balance to strike, and they will have to look very carefully at this, I think.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's broadly right. Yeah, I do. I think it's actually it's interesting that certain things. So I was thinking about this in relation to when I was growing up. The big sort of moral justice cause focused on the international stage was the anti-apartheid movement. I'm not saying that's equivalent with the Israel situation now, but that was something where artists would express themselves very strongly. First of all, I don't remember that being done in terms of demanding death to white South Africans on television. But second of all, I don't know what the BBC did then. There were only 2 BBC channels on television, 4 on the radio. It was a very different world. But so I think that's right. I think at some stage there's actually a more complicated, interesting conversation to be had about what the role of a national broadcaster is in giving expression to quite a polarised culture like that.
OK, well, one of the other big stories this morning is the government's problems with welfare reform and its welfare reform bill. The Financial Times reporting that Keir Starmer faces backbench showdown despite rowing back over the welfare bill. The Times also reporting this story, saying the Prime Minister battles to stave off the revolt over welfare cuts. And The Guardian also saying that Rebel Labour whip, that's Vicky Foxcroft, who resigned in protest, calls for more welfare concessions, despite there, of course, being an awful lot already. Well, let's speak to Henry Zeffman, our chief political correspondent, about all of this. And Henry, I mean, there's been a lot of concessions, but do you think it is possible that the government is either going to have to give more or that they will still face defeat?
I think the government will probably be OK, but the fact that the government has made such major concessions at the back end of last week, and we still can't say with certainty that they are going to win this vote tomorrow, even with Sir Keir Starmer's historically vast majority, tells you just how botched and bungled this process has been from the point of view of the government. I think what you're going to see today is an attempt by the government, through putting on sort of formal parliamentary record concessions that they've already communicated privately and then in the media, an attempt to just kind of take the heat out of this. So far, though, it is quite notable that there are still, a good few dozen Labour MPs who say that the concessions aren't enough. In fact, in some cases, they say that the concessions have opened up a whole new can of worms because there'll be differential treatment between people who are currently in receipt of disability benefits and people who might be in receipt of disability benefits in the future. So I think you still have a very dicey couple of days until that vote for the government, all of it in the context of the government having decided to make those concessions to avoid what, by the end of last week, had become all but inevitable defeat on this issue.
OK, Henry, well, we'll hear from you in a little bit about Starmer's first year, but thank you for now. Natasha, do you think this is going to get through?
I think it's far more likely that it will do. In my personal view, I'm far more likely to support this now that we've heard of the concessions coming down the line. I think the place we all start at is not that we all start that this system needs to change. It absolutely needs to change. It's failing the people that rely on it now, and it will fail people in the future. But the question is, how do you change it? I'm really keen to see the detail that comes forward today.
So you're still undecided at this point whether you might vote against?
I need to understand what we mean by co-production. I need to understand the timetable of that. I'm minded to support.
Do you mean this is about disabled groups being involved?
Absolutely.
In the changes?
I want to make sure that that's not a tick box exercise. I want to make sure that's genuine co-production. What I want to also understand is, whilst I am genuinely relieved for the people within my constituency that claim PIP, not just because a lot of them are in work and PIP is helping them to do the jobs that they love and live the lives that they want to with independence, but also the unintended consequences and the pressures that could put on things like housing, for example. You know, the council that I'm an MP under, the commissioners are at their door, and if you have a few hundred people turning up needing housing because they can no longer cover the cost of their rent, what does that do? So that was my massive concern when we started having these conversations, and I had those conversations in private, just as many of my
Did you sign the
colleagues.
amendment?
I didn't, but I continued to have those conversations in private and made very clear my views on that behind closed doors. So I'm really hopeful that we are now in a space where it's a two-way conversation. I'm really hopeful that where we get to at the end of this is a genuine change in a system that is completely broken and isn't working, but puts disabled people at the heart of it. But I need to see the detail today.
James, what do you think should happen?
Well, you've just heard the sound of a party that has lost a grip of its own backbenchers. I mean, that is extraordinary at this stage of the parliamentary cycle, with such a huge majority and in theory, a team that is meant to know what it's doing. I am so shocked and so surprised that this has slipped out of Number 10's fingers. And it makes me think that, are they capable of actually seeing their agenda get through Parliament at all? Because these cuts are painful, and Natasha put it very well, but they are absolutely necessary. We do need to balance the books. And Rachel Reeves has staked her political reputation on making tough decisions and balancing the books. There's no new taxes in autumn. And I know hardly anyone in Westminster who doesn't think that there's going to be a tax rise before the end of the year. And if that happens, then both the political and economic credibility of the government is going to take a really huge hit. And I don't say that in order to score political points. I say it out of sadness, because we need this country. The country needs this government to succeed.
Natasha, you've lost control?
So I obviously would challenge that. I don't think this is a case of losing control. What I think this is an ongoing conversation between backbench MPs and a government that is desperately trying to change this country. And I think even those who signed the amendment desperately want this government to succeed, but also are very positive and supportive of not just the Prime Minister, but the people around the cabinet table who we know have a colossal job to turn this country around.
Yes, but you're asking very reasonable questions about the implementation. These should have all been anticipated months ago. And I remember in 2010 when there was a similar kind of round of tough decisions that needed to be made by the government, backbenchers had to be handled extremely carefully. That handling clearly hasn't happened.
I think hopefully going forward we come to a different place now. I think this is a lesson for everybody who...
Are you surprised how it's been handled?
My background is I used to be a local councillor, and I used to deal with our own political wranglings, but obviously not on this scale.
But this is a flagship policy, isn't it? And James is right. This is second reading.
So my feeling of this is that we do need a better way of having that two-way conversation, and I do genuinely believe that is what's going to happen now. And there are difficult choices to come down the line. There are things we have to do to change this country. And I think that we will get there now quicker, and I think we'll have better conversations as we go forward.
Raphael, are you surprised about how this has panned out?
I am a little bit, actually, just to the extent that, as far as I understand it, certainly the whips were aware that this was coming in as well. So actually, it's not the problem with the whipping operation. This is something's happened. Someone dropped the ball higher up the chain of command in Number 10. I think but that expresses a deeper structural problem, which is that you have two totally separate arguments. One is there is a fiscal commitment has been made and a fiscal framework that's been settled by the Treasury, and that means you have to make savings somewhere because you've promised not to raise taxes or borrow more. And then separately, you've got an agenda to reform the benefits system, which can have a compassionate humanitarian agenda to try and help people who aren't in work get into work, or to find better support for disabled people. And those two things actually have now sort of been crashed into one another, largely because the fiscal headroom went down, and at the very last minute you needed a bit more money for the Treasury, and that came from PIPs. And so there is a kind of disingenuousness baked into this process very, very late in the day, which was to say, well, our sort of ethical justification of this is still the one for welfare reform, but actually everyone knows it's been driven by a fiscal imperative. And when you're making an argument for a policy based on its own terms, but absolutely everyone involved in the process, including the Parliamentary Labour Party, knows that really it's a fiscal problem, it's very hard to make the argument and win the argument because you sound dishonest.
Merci.
Yeah, I think it's both an ethical problem and a fiscal problem, and I don't think those two things sort of have to necessarily be in conflict with one another. My position is that, I think the benefits, the welfare system is the fundamental premise of universal credit is good and it's a sound one. And for the most part, it does work. And I'm very in favour of having, a safety blanket for people who do need it. I have close family members who are on PIP. 10 years ago, when I was a teenage mum, I was on universal credit. I know how important, having that safety blanket is for people. However, we are in a position now where it does seem that some of these Labour rebels and Labour MPs seem to think that their position seems to be that every single person who has been put on incapacity benefits needs to be on incapacity benefits and should be on incapacity benefits. And actually, I think I would have liked to see more honesty from the Prime Minister and actually say, look, 1,000 people are signing on to incapacity benefits every day, I think. And actually, we do need to come to a position where we say we need to change the criteria. Not everybody needs to be, and put in place.
So there's the PIP, which is not an out of work benefit, is it? I mean, that's different. So that you can be in work and be on personal independence payments.
Yes, absolutely. You can be in work and be on personal independence payments because it's about sort of health and disability. But my point is that not everybody who is also being put on PIP or incapacity benefits needs to be on it. And actually, I think this is a bit of a function of the fact that GPs are overburdened. Often the case is that people are presenting to the GP with problems and they're often sort of left with not many options but to give that person to sign them off work. And in a lot of cases, people actually don't need to be signed off work, and actually being signed off work sort of almost compounds the health problems and the mental health problems they're facing.
I think we have to be really careful about how we discuss this, because people don't just sign on to PIP. They have to go through a process, and it's quite an arduous process. And there is an assessment that happens about whether or not they need support. And I think, to be honest, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State have been very honest about the amount of people that are signed on. We know that stat of 1,000 a day because they keep saying it. So I think they've been very honest about that. What we need is to fix this system, but make it make sense for the people that do genuinely rely on it. And we need to make sure that the assessment process, gives people the support they need to live independent lives. That's what PIP is. It's an independence payment. It's not about. It's about trying to get people to be able to live well instead of just.
Natasha, one aspect of the welfare bill rising is that those claiming sickness benefits for non-physical conditions. If you look at this headline in The Guardian, 1 in 4 young people in England have mental health conditions. That's according to an NHS survey. It's saying that rates are higher in young women as in young men, and that mental ill health is up across all age groups. Let's speak now to Natasha Devon. She's a mental health campaigner. Thank you for joining us. We can see the figures there. Why is this happening, do you think?
Well, the Lancet Psychiatry Commission on Mental Health published a report a year ago now, which comes the closest to answering this question in an all-encompassing way, and one that reflects my experience. I've been visiting schools and colleges now throughout the UK for 17 years. And they identified 4 things. One was young people not being listened to about their mental health concerns. And we've seen that in some of the political language that has been used by people like Nigel Farage, but also Wes Streeting, talking about overdiagnosis. The second was the systemic underfunding of mental health services throughout the world. The third was neoliberalism, young people living in a more competitive and individualistic environment and culture, which puts them under way more pressure than previous generations. And then the fourth was social media. I would add to that changes to the education system, which have meant that things like sports and arts and music, which have a proven therapeutic value, have been underfunded and underprioritized. And of course, COVID, which has exacerbated all of those phenomena.
And why do you think women seem to be more badly affected, particularly young women?
It's interesting. So women are more likely to diagnose and disclose, but that doesn't necessarily mean that young women are more likely to suffer. What we see is elevated rates of addiction in men. Men are 3 times more likely to need to seek help for drug or alcohol dependency. And we also see higher rates of suicide in men. So what that suggests is women are seeking help for anxiety and depression, maybe seeking help earlier, and men are more likely to self-medicate and or reach crisis point.
And Natasha in the studio, I mean, do you think that that diagnosis is correct about the causes here?
So the thing around the comments around overdiagnosis, I think that what the Health Secretary actually said was we need to follow the evidence. And if the evidence is showing more and more people being able to identify that they have an issue or ask for help, I think that's what's happening. The people are now being able to articulate how they feel and are being able to go and seek help, and we shouldn't discourage that, and we should be very careful about how we talk about this. In terms of young people, and you know, Natasha's absolutely right, which that's a bit weird, sorry, Natasha. When we talk about young people and the reduction in services for them, so the early help prevention things like youth services, things that when they look around their communities and they go, that is for me, that's been completely wiped away. We've had a 73% cut in that sort of service. But then when we then look at things like the help they get at school, it's taken a very long time to get mental health in support in schools, and that's what this government has focused on doing, because we know that earlier we do this, the easier it is to then allow young people to become healthy, happy adults as they get older.
James?
I think it's really tough being young at the moment. I've got 4 teenage kids, and it's miserable. And you look at their mental health and the incidence of suicide attempt, self-harm, all of this. There's definitely something going on here. I don't agree with the analysis, though. I think kids are missing out on things like family and community, for sure. I don't think being competitive is a bad thing. Actually, we are built to be competitive. What is bad is not being able to meet your aspirations or your expectations. And there's something about the economy going sideways and young people being unable to get the incomes and the houses that they think that they would like, and I would like them to have. That pressure on young people is utterly miserable. And I would emphasise the social media part. In answer to your question on women, the misogyny of the social media environment is absolutely revolting. We haven't faced into that nearly enough. You can't medicalise an answer to that. You do have to reform the behaviours and rules of how people interact on social media, I think.
And Raphael, do you think the government has a role in this, and what is that role?
Well, inevitably, the government has a role because the Secretary of State for Health is in charge of the NHS, and this is, you know, obviously, if they've got 1 in 4 young people being diagnosed with a mental health problem, that is something that there's a political dimension to that. I mean, it's very difficult because, first of all, you know, another thing that the Wes Streeting said that I think is worth drawing out of this, and maybe just because I happen to agree with him on this point, you know, he did make the point that every mental disorder is a spectrum. So, and actually, so you can have 2 things true at the same time, which is more people being more aware of what their symptoms might mean, better able to vocalise that, express that. Actually, there being less stigma sometimes that allows people to talk about it. And actually, I generally agree about social media, but there is a positive element to this, which is people who might otherwise have felt very isolated and very lonely, finding other people who are showing the same symptoms as them, actually understanding their situation better and being able to express it better. But that means you can get this point on the spectrum where, you know, mild cases get pathologised, and, you know, it's very hard to know what is actually a genuine, that's the wrong word, but a wider expression of people being really severely ill, and lots of people who previously wouldn't necessarily have been identified as being mentally ill, having mental illness. And if that then, this is in answer to your question, feeds into demands on the NHS, you need a totally new structure for the sort of triaging, actually, who gets treatment. And crucially, big question, how are you going to pay for it?
Mercy?
I actually think social media is almost entirely to blame, actually, for young people's mental health. And I think it's quite a scandal, actually, that we have almost given young people just this sort of blank check, unbridled access to social media. And that's really where, if I was the Prime Minister, I would really, really look at sort of limiting children's access to social media. So that's the first thing. I think on the point about over-subscribing, I think that's actually entirely right, and a survey we did of GPs found that 8 in 10 do think antidepressants are oversubscribed, and, you know, 1 in 5 adults in the UK is on antidepressants. So there is a crisis here, really. I think the question, again, goes back to what we've been speaking about. Where are you going to get the money? What are you going to do about it? And we know that the state of public finances is such that, you know, there's not much the government really can do about it in terms of throwing more money at the problem. So we do need to, I think, have a fundamental rethink about what is on offer. You know, social prescribing, for example, we could be making much more use of that rather than just giving people medication education. There's lots of sort of models we could be exploring because we simply just don't have the money.
So I would just say I think that's very much what's coming out in the 10-year plan for the NHS. That's a lot of work is going into that call to take treatment from hospital to the community and prevention. The Prudence Trust with the Centre of Young Lives published a report about the treatment gap for mental health support for young people versus adults. And there's like a 55% treatment gap in the amount of money allocated. But in that report, it argues not just throwing money at medicalising children, but also providing that upstream support, that stuff within the community, which is cheaper and will support them and keep them healthier for longer. And if we can move our NHS more into that sort of space, into how we create healthy, happier communities, then hopefully we can start to turn the tide on this.
If I could just bring in Natasha about what you feel about what you've heard, particularly, I mean, the government is talking about restricting access to things like PIP benefits. They're restricting it for those with mental health issues, particularly the young. What do you make of that?
I think it's important to acknowledge that we are where we are, with 6 million people, according to the charity Mind, currently waiting for mental health NHS support, partially and in a big way because of austerity. 14 years of Tory austerity has removed community. It's shut down things like sports clubs, libraries, youth clubs. One of the reasons that young people are on social media so much is because it's one of the only ways for them to access community in the absence of it in their three-dimensional lives. So just blaming social media is hugely reductive, I think. And so if we're talking about this as a cost-cutting exercise, that's the wrong way to approach the problem. It's just kicking the can down the road.
James, what do you say to that?
Well, Natasha puts it very persuasively. I think that our country's struggle to have the social infrastructure that it deserves is partly economic. We haven't been able to cover the bills. But what is new and acute in the last 8 years has been the iPhone with a camera on it, and this intense pressure on kids to perform, to look good, to compare themselves to one another. You can't ignore the huge and devastating effect. And to Natasha's point, the 10-year plan is going to come out with almost no measures to address the thing that's driving the demand for these services. To me, that's a huge gaping hole. There should have been much more support for the NHS in terms of, well, on obesity, things like sugar tax, and on mental health, things like social media and preventing young people from accessing services that are driving them mad.
And what about this rise in those who are claiming disability benefits because of mental health issues?
I think it's great. I frankly think it's great that more people are seeking help and are getting diagnosed and are gaining some kind of support. Whether that should be through the NHS and at great cost and should be supported by welfare, I'm pretty sceptical about. I think that that kind of support should be outside of the clinical, very expensive framework and done more in what we could broadly call the community through schools and workplace and other institutions. We're making a mistake by lumbering all of this on the NHS.
That's still coming out of government Whitehall money in the ultimately.
Not necessarily, because a consultant in the NHS is on £200,000, whereas a health manager might be on £35,000 and actually have more time and more support for someone who's struggling.
You've got CBT therapists going to schools, if you're really putting in the infrastructure. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the underlying point, but finding ways to say, I think you can't kind of resolve from the fact that there's basically a fiscal choice here. You're either going to find new ways of raising revenue to finance all the wonderful things we would like to do here, or you're saying we can't afford it, so we can't have a lot of that.
There are better ways of doing things. The old way of doing things with a very expensive CBT consultant on every single case is totally unaffordable. Actually, there's workforces out there that should be embraced who can make a big difference. And I think we need to modernise the way in which we handle mental health.
I think respectfully, if it could have been done better over the last 14 years, then it should have been done. If there were ideas on the table that would have made things better, so we weren't in this situation. I think that we've recruited 6,700 extra mental health workers in this space, so it is a start. I do think that the points around social media. I was so grateful to grow up in the 90s when no one could see me, and I got to decide who I was before I presented myself to the world.
Sasha, is the system sustainable though? Because that more than half of the rise in working age disability claims since the COVID pandemic is related to mental health or behavioural conditions.
So of course it's not sustainable to have a lot of very unwell people needing support to get through their lives, and that's why we have to prevent that from happening in the first place. I do agree that if we don't, as I said earlier, if young people are growing up in a country where they look around them and they can't see anything in their community that is for them, that helps their development into young adults, then the crisis that builds up and the retreat into your phone is ever easier. This stuff is not new. You know, we've had adolescents and teenagers, Brighton Beach, all that sort of thing has happened for ages, and yet we have forgotten that if we do not invest in young people properly, these are the things that happen.
And Natasha Devon, the government is going to come out with its 10-year plan for the NHS. What would you like to see in that?
I'm pretty optimistic, actually, about the things that we're hoping to see on that plan. So having the NHS reach out to businesses and small charities within the community to provide holistic support for people, I think is really good. But the one thing that I want to say to everything that I've heard so far in this discussion, Generation Z have been frankly screwed at every turn. They have been to school, college, university under austerity and throughout the pandemic. They now can't afford to get on the housing ladder. They can't afford a decent standard of living. If you want them into work, if you want them paying taxes and community and contributing to society, you are going to have to invest in them. And that will cost money, but it will pay dividends in the future.
Natasha, thank you very much for giving us your insight into all of this and this issue, which, as we all know, is one that will continue. Now, thank you very much for joining us at this earlier time. Here are the times for the rest of this week so that you can put them in your diary. We're on earlier again on Tuesday and Thursday. On Wednesday, it's our usual time of 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions at midday. Now, remember this?
I have just returned from Buckingham Palace, where I accepted an invitation from His Majesty the King to form the next government of this great nation.
Well, I was sitting on a settee with Vic, my wife, and our 2 kids. The moment the exit poll came through was an incredible moment because we'd got a victory, and quite a significant victory. I was conscious of the sense of responsibility that would bring.
Some people say that on the morning of July the 5th, in the early hours, you were slightly annoyed out of competitiveness that it wasn't as big as Blair's landslide. Is that true?
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm hugely competitive, whether it's on the football pitch, whether it's in politics or any other aspect of life.
Now, that's from a Radio 4 documentary, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds. It's called Starmer's Stormy Year, and it's by our very own Henry Zeffman, who joins us now. Henry, things haven't got much easier, have they, in the last week or so? But what's your assessment of where it really started to go wrong?
Well, that's the thing, Vicky. The last week has clearly been Keir Starmer's worst as Prime Minister. But actually, I think a lot of the themes of this week reflect things that have been going on for the last year, and actually perhaps even before then, because one of the things that lots of the people I spoke to for this programme admitted with varying degrees of candour was that their preparations for government were not quite good enough. Now, of course, you have to stress that their inheritance was staggeringly difficult domestically and internationally, but nevertheless, a lot of people, when this Labour Party got into government, were saying, is that really it? And that is something that I discussed in one of his most revealing interviews yet with Simon Case, who until recently was the head of the civil service.
There were some elements where not enough thinking had been done. There were some areas where sitting in the centre of government, early in a new regime, the Prime Minister and his team, and including me as his sort of core team, knew what we wanted to do, but we weren't communicating that effectively across all of government. Ministers come in and they're suddenly in charge in our big departments of hundreds of thousands of people. They will never have done that before, so there is a lot to learn. But I think communication is something, perhaps with the outside world, wasn't strong enough.
Now, Henry, on the international stage, I think most people would agree that things have gone a little bit better for Keir Starmer.
Yeah, and it's easy to forget now, but actually for the first several months of Keir Starmer's premiership on the international stage, or at least when it comes to America, he was dealing with President Biden, not President Trump. I mean, within days of becoming Prime Minister, he flew out for a NATO summit in Washington, D.C., and to meet Joe Biden in the Oval Office. Joe Biden, who at the time was still resisting calls from senior Democrats to drop out. And I interviewed about that meeting, but also about how Keir Starmer has handled Donald Trump, a man called Jake Sullivan, who had been Joe Biden's national security advisor. And this is how he reflected on Keir Starmer's interactions with Donald Trump.
I just thought he had a very simple, straightforward, direct, no-nonsense approach in the public part of that meeting, and from what I've heard in the private part as well, that was, from my perspective, the best I've seen in terms of a leader in these early weeks going to sit down with the current president.
It's probably true to say, Henry, isn't it, that voters here probably decide how things are going based more on domestic issues. Now, what about the influence of reform and the impact they've had, particularly with that by-election win?
Yeah, I mean, I think the start of May felt like a real political turning point because you had those local elections where Reform won lots of councils across England. Even if they were previously controlled by the Conservatives, often that was still causing great anxiety among Labour. And then, of course, on the same day, they also won the Runcorn and Helsby by-election by a wafer-thin margin. I mean, I think we've seen the impact in terms of the government very quickly afterwards ditching its controversial winter fuel policy. And I've got an interesting interview with Pat McFadden in the programme where he speaks about the reasons why they decided to do that. I've also got hold of, and this is in the Radio 4 programme as well, a strategy document that was circulated in Downing Street just a couple of days after those elections. And it says that the government now needs what's described as a relentless focus on the new centre ground of British politics. And they are described as middle-aged, working-class, economically squeezed voters who want the government to fix the cost of living, fix the NHS and reduce migration. Now, how that strategy fits in with what Keir Starmer's been saying in various places over the last few days about regretting elements of his political strategy over his first year, I think is a very interesting question going forwards.
Thank you very much, Henry. Natasha, what do you make of what's gone on in this year?
Well, I mean, it's been a heck of a year. It's been really exciting, and it's been a massive privilege to be part of this government. And I am really proud that Britain is back on the world stage, as you were pointing out, and that we're now taken seriously again. We've managed to lock down 3 international trade deals.
Things have gone better internationally, haven't they? Don't you think, than domestically?
People voted for us because they wanted things to change here domestically, of course. They knew that this country deserved better than a crumbling NHS and crumbling schools and a housing crisis. And we've come in to fix those things. And yes, there's been, issues here and there, but actually, by and large, this government is moving things in the right direction, is on the road to recovery. Change is not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do. And we were very clear coming into the election that this was going to take some time. It wasn't going to happen overnight.
But aren't you concerned, listening to to lots of people on the inside who felt that actually the government, they weren't ready? Keir Starmer wasn't ready. His team weren't ready for what was coming.
Well, I mean, I wasn't there. I wasn't having those conversations. I was running around doorsteps in Croydon. But I think we as a movement, as a party, have to make that transition from campaigning mode to being in government, and that's a whole new skill set. And I think what you're seeing is a government that has grown in confidence in that space and is doing better in that space, and it has got to grips with some of the most knotty and difficult issues that this country has faced, and has run at them headlong and is trying to undo all that.
Raphael, what do you make of the way that Keir Starmer has handled this? Has he got a clear message for the electorate, do you think?
I think that is probably there's been a central deficiency, actually, is in terms of the communications. I think Keir Starmer, in many ways, very qualified to be Prime Minister and very effective dealing with Donald Trump. That's a diplomatic challenge. But there's been this sort of absence of a clear storytelling. I mean, the Prime Minister also has to be sort of explainer-in-chief to bring people along with what he's doing. And I think this connects to that problem of underpreparedness, because there was a very clever, very effective election-winning strategy, which was to build a coalition of voters who were all united by the urgency they felt in wanting to get the Tories out. And that was a lot of people. And there was a particularly good way of maximising that through the electoral system, system. So you combine a kind of first past the post, how do we find all the right people who want to get the Tories out, get a maximum number of seats, and then you get this very broad, very large parliamentary majority on actually quite a thin mandate without having really explained what happens once the Tories are out. And the Tories are out. And frankly, I'm afraid, James, Tories aren't really coming back anytime soon that I can see. And so that the sort of the raison d'etre for that coalition has slightly unravelled. And in the meantime, if in the run-up to election you say, look, don't give too much away, be a small target, sort of sneak up on power, and you go up to it in a sort of defensive crouch, if you don't sort of talk about these things, you want to say too much, that's a really strong incentive to also not think about them. And I think that's where you got into the situation where you then arrive in power and you actually haven't really worked out what the programme is with enough clarity.
Mercy, Keir Starmer paints himself as a pragmatist, really, that there's problems that he will solve, and he would argue there are a lot of problems to be solved.
Yeah, and look, of course we want a pragmatic, government. That's sort of the bare minimum I think we'd expect from a Prime Minister. I think where Keir Starmer does fail is in articulating a vision and sticking to a very clear vision. And, let's be honest, people in Britain, voters, they want a narrative. They want a narrative about what kind of country they want to live in, how the Prime Minister sees the kind of country we want to live in. I don't think I've heard Keir Starmer sort of articulating that big vision. And that's why I think we are sort of seeing these U-turns, because there's no real, key message that he's sort of stuck to, that he's pinned his mast to. And so that's why we're seeing U-turns, and I believe that's why we're seeing Reform doing incredibly well, because whether you like it or not, Nigel Farage is an incredible political communicator, and he is succeeding in communicating the vision of the country that Reform would sort of put in place and would implement if he came into power.
I don't think he's articulating a vision of what Reform would do at all. I think he's very good at sort of galvanising and sort of channeling a sense of frustration and anger with an idea of what the country is now. And I don't even think it's a very accurate picture of what the whole country is now. But it's a lot easier to say everything's rubbish, everything's falling apart, they're all these awful politicians, we should get rid of them. That's actually, and he is a very gifted communicator, I absolutely agree with that. But that is a very different proposition to saying here is actually a functional, workable plan for what you would do. That's much harder. Farage never gives you that.
That hasn't worked, though. So, yes, you can put to the public, this is a 10-point plan of everything we'll do. That's what Keir Starmer's done. He's put forward the pragmatic approach. And actually, I think the more important thing is actually convincing people, one, you have a plan that you believe in and you have a vision for the country you believe in. And he's completely kind of missed the mark on that.
I think it's making people feel that the change is happening. So if you get 2 million extra appointments into the NHS, if we've seen, wages grow more in the last 10 months than they had in the last 10 years of the last Conservative government, those things make tangible difference to people and will make them feel that change is actually impacting them.
But Natasha, in terms of having a message, you can see that Keir Starmer has been trying to really tackle head-on with Nigel Farage and Reform. He made that speech where he talked about, we can see the headline here, BBC News, he talked about an island of strangers, and now he says he regrets it. I mean, it does feel like the U-turns are causing confusion, really.
I think we've got a Prime Minister that's trying to listen and trying to make sure that he...
But if someone criticises, he just changes his mind.
I don't think that's fair. There's been other things that he's stuck to his guns about. And I think that what we see now is everybody wants to live in a country that feels like it's actually working and that people can just live and not have to, can be concerned about keeping a roof over their head and food.
James, I mean, a lot of the problems, the argument would be, were left by your government.
Undoubtedly, but I think that's... speaking as a member of the Guild of Former Ministers, there is a communication problem, which I think people have articulated well. There's also been this chronic execution problem. I thought that they had spoken to everyone before they came into power and had arrived with some sort of
They would say the problems were even worse than they realised.
That's just not plausible.
Because
everyone
of your
was very transparent. The data is all there. They spoke to everyone and understood what the challenges were. And by the way, in conversation, often articulated ambitions to do the right sort of thing. But if you look at industrial policy, education reform, what they're doing in the countryside, social care reform, kicking the can down.
But as Natasha said earlier, you did have 14 years to deal with this.
We did, and I'm not making a Tory point here. I'm making a point that I'm absolutely astonished how badly prepared they were when they turned up. And a lot of the problems they're having now is that they're not making the important, correct decisions, for which often they would get credit, including from potential Labour reform switchers. But they're not making it. And this PIP reform is a classic example of that. It's actually an execution problem more than a communication problem.
OK, that's all for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live here at 10:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer.